The people in the big courtroom thought Barron Trump was just a rich kid who didn't know much. But then he surprised everyone and changed everything. The courtroom in Los Angeles, California, was full. There were lawyers, reporters, and people who just wanted to watch. They thought this would be a normal day in court. Cameras clicked, people whispered, and everyone waited to see what would happen. At the front of the room, sitting in a big chair, was Judge William Prescott. He was a serious man who didn't like people who tried to act smart in his courtroom. He always made fair decisions, and he didn't care if someone was rich or famous. Today he was looking at Barron Trump, who was standing before him. The judge leaned back in his chair and tapped his gavel on the desk. He looked at Barron, who was only 18 years old and wearing a fancy suit that looked brand new. The judge sighed and adjusted his glasses. "Mr. Trump," the judge said, sounding a little amused, "this is a first for me. An 18-year-old wants to argue a case in my courtroom. I know your last name opens doors for you, but not here." Some people in the courtroom laughed. Even some of the lawyers smiled at each other. But Barron didn't laugh. He didn't look nervous or embarrassed. He just stood there quietly, his hands folded, looking straight at the judge. The judge raised an eyebrow. "Nothing to say? No speech prepared? I thought you would at least try to tell me why you should be here." More people chuckled. Someone in the crowd whispered, "He doesn't belong here." Finally, Barron spoke. His voice wasn't loud, but it was clear and steady. "I didn't think this courtroom was for entertainment, Your Honor." The laughter stopped. Some people raised their eyebrows. The judge's small smile almost disappeared. "Well," the judge said, flipping through the papers in front of him, "let's see if you can back up your confidence with more than just your last name." The air in the room changed. People had expected Barron to stumble over his words and embarrass himself. They thought this was just a lesson that being rich didn't mean being smart. But now they weren't so sure. The judge adjusted his glasses and waved his hand. "All right, let's hear what you've got." No one in the room, not the lawyers, not the reporters, not even the people watching on TV, was ready for what happened next. Barron stepped forward, calm and sure. He placed a stack of papers neatly on the podium and opened a legal brief, just like a real lawyer would. The judge watched him, still expecting him to hesitate or stutter. But Barron didn't. Instead, he adjusted the microphone and spoke clearly. "Your Honor, before we begin, I'd like to correct some mistakes in the legal arguments that have already been made." The room, which had been full of whispers and scribbling reporters, suddenly went silent. Barron continued, speaking confidently. "The other lawyers have been using the case of Harper versus Sullivan to say that some important testimony should be ignored. But that case was about evidence that was taken the wrong way in an illegal search. That doesn't apply to this case." Across the room, the main lawyer for the other side, a man in his 50s with years of experience, shifted in his seat and quickly looked through his notes. The judge raised an eyebrow. "Is that true?" Barron nodded and turned a page in his brief. "Yes, Your Honor. If we want to talk about whether testimony is allowed, Foster versus Crane is actually the better case to look at. That case talks about how testimony can be trusted, even if someone tries to say it's not fair." A quiet murmur spread through the courtroom. Some of the legal experts in the audience exchanged looks. This wasn't just a kid using big words. This was real, careful legal thinking. Judge Prescott leaned forward a little. His smirk was gone now. The opposing lawyer wasn't going to let an 18-year-old shake him. He straightened his tie and stood up. "Your Honor, with all due respect, this isn't a law school debate. What matters is that." Barron didn't let him finish. "If you want to ignore a case just because it doesn't help you, that means your argument is weak, not mine." The courtroom went completely silent. The opposing lawyer hesitated for just a second. And in that moment, the power in the room shifted. Judge Prescott turned to the lawyer. "Would you like to respond to that?" A long pause. Then, through clenched teeth, the lawyer said, "I'll talk about it in my argument, Your Honor." It was a retreat. Everyone knew it. The judge knew it. The lawyers knew it. The reporters definitely knew it. And Barron? He simply adjusted his papers and waited for what came next. Judge Prescott tapped his pen on the desk. When he spoke again, his tone was different. He wasn't amused anymore. "Continue, Mr. Trump." But this wasn't just about continuing. This was about proving that his first moment wasn't just luck. The judge had seen many confident lawyers before. Some of them thought they were smarter than everyone else. But this was different. An 18-year-old, standing in court, speaking without fear, making arguments that even experienced lawyers had to stop and think about? That was new. Judge Prescott watched Barron closely. There was no arrogance in him. He wasn't showing off. He wasn't acting like he was better than everyone. He was just stating facts clearly and correctly. The opposing lawyer took a deep breath and flipped through his notes. He needed to take control of the situation again. "Your Honor," he said, "Mr. Trump's reference to Foster versus Crane is impressive, but it doesn't fit this case. That case was about forced testimony, not about whether the evidence is allowed." Barron didn't hesitate. "Actually, the lawyer is mistaken." He lifted another page from his documents and held it up. That case didn't just talk about forced testimony. It also said that testimony is still valid if it wasn't forced under pressure. That's why our witness's statement in this case is still protected. The judge raised his eyebrows slightly. He glanced at the opposing lawyer, waiting for a response. But the lawyer had nothing to say. A low murmur spread through the audience. One reporter at the front typed quickly on his laptop. Another legal expert whispered something to her colleague. Barron continued. "If we throw away testimony just because it's inconvenient for one side, that's not just wrong. It's dangerous. If we start choosing which legal rules we follow based on what's easier, then we hurt the justice system." The room was silent. Then the judge let out a breath. It wasn't quite a sigh. It wasn't quite a laugh. It was the sound of someone realizing something big had just happened. No one in that courtroom had expected Barron Trump to be this prepared, this knowledgeable, or this sharp. And yet, there he was, standing confidently, proving that he wasn't just a privileged kid. Judge Prescott looked down at his papers, then back up at Barron. He nodded slightly as if to say, "All right, let's see what else you've got." The case wasn't over yet. But one thing was clear. Barron Trump wasn't just playing lawyer. He was winning. The judge leaned back in his big chair and put his hands together. He looked straight at the young man standing before him. "Well, Mr. Trump," the judge said, his voice calm, "I have to say, I didn't expect that." The room felt different now. Some of the lawyers in the courtroom glanced at each other. It was clear. This wasn't just a simple test anymore. The judge wasn't just checking if Barron Trump, the young man in front of him, knew a little bit about the law. Now the judge was paying full attention to him. But the lawyer arguing against Barron wasn't ready to give up. He took a step forward and spoke quickly. His voice was sharp, like he was trying to cut through the moment. "Your Honor, we're getting off track here," the lawyer said. "We are still discussing." Barron didn't look nervous. He tilted his head slightly and said, "If the law doesn't help your argument, that's not my problem." Someone in the back of the room let out a small chuckle before quickly covering their mouth. The lawyer clenched his teeth. He flipped through his notes again, trying to find something, anything, to fight back. But it was too late. The damage had already been done. He was now on the defensive. Judge Prescott, the man in charge, breathed out through his nose. His face showed no emotion. Then he nodded. "All right, Mr. Trump. Keep going." Now everyone in the courtroom was watching Barron. They weren't just looking at him anymore. They were really paying attention. The room had fallen silent. People who had been writing notes had stopped. Even those who didn't believe in him before now had a different look in their eyes. They were curious. The judge leaned forward slightly. He put his hands together, resting them on his desk, and looked at the young man standing there. "All right, Mr. Trump," he said. His voice was more serious now. "Since you seem so well prepared, tell me this. What do you believe is the biggest problem with what the other side is saying?" Barron flipped to another page in his notebook. He didn't pause. He didn't try to act dramatic. He simply answered. "They are using a case called Keating versus Burlington the wrong way," Barron said calmly. A soft wave of murmurs spread through the lawyers behind the other attorney. The lead lawyer stiffened. "That case has been used in many courts," the lawyer said firmly. "It is a strong example of why certain types of evidence should not be allowed." Barron nodded once. "That's correct. But if you actually read the full decision instead of just picking the parts that help you, you would remember that the ruling clearly says the only time evidence should be dismissed is when a mistake in procedure makes the evidence unreliable. That hasn't happened here. You're not using the law correctly, you're hiding behind it." Judge Prescott blinked. He sat there, taking in what Barron had just said. The other lawyer's jaw tightened. His face turned slightly red as he flipped through his own papers. Barron, still calm, continued. "If this court accepts your argument, it would create a big problem. It would mean that small technical mistakes could be used to throw out important evidence, even when that evidence is completely reliable. That's not how the law is supposed to work, and I think the court knows that." Silence. The other lawyer took a sharp breath. Then he closed his folder as if he realized there was nothing more he could say. He had lost this round. The judge tapped his fingers on the table, nodding slowly. "That's an interesting way to look at it." He let out a slow breath before speaking again. "So, Mr. Trump, let me ask you, if we follow your reasoning, what should the court do next? Everyone in the room held their breath. Barron didn't even pause. He placed his hands on the podium and looked the judge in the eye. You should allow the testimony. Anything else would go against the way the law is meant to work. The judge studied him, his face unreadable. This time, Barron hadn't just defended his position. He had taken control of the conversation. But there was still one final moment that left the courtroom in complete silence. The lawyer against Barron opened his mouth as if he was going to argue back. But nothing came out. He looked down at his papers, flipping one page then another. But there was nothing there that could help him. The judge let the silence stretch. The weight of the moment was thick in the air. Even the reporters, some of whom had come expecting a completely different story, had stopped writing. They were just watching. Finally, the judge cleared his throat. Mr. Trump, do you realize what you've just done? Barron met the judge's gaze as steady as ever. I gave the only answer that follows the law, Your Honor. Judge Prescott exhaled sharply. It wasn't exactly a laugh, but it wasn't dismissal either. Then he turned to the other lawyer. Counselor, do you have anything to say in response? The lawyer stood stiffly. His arms were crossed. His jaw was tight. He knew the truth just like everyone else. Barron had just taken apart his entire argument, piece by piece. Trying to fight back now would only make him look weaker. After a long pause, the lawyer finally spoke. No further objections, Your Honor. A soft murmur ran through the courtroom. Barron Trump, the 18-year-old they had laughed at just a short time ago, had just forced an experienced legal team to retreat. The judge rapped his gavel twice. In that case, the testimony will remain in this case. And just like that, the tension that had filled the room broke. Some people gasped. A few whispered. A reporter in the back even muttered, unbelievable. Barron let out a slow breath, not one of relief but of knowing. He had known all along that this was how it would end. Judge Prescott looked at him for a long time. The doubt he had before was gone. What replaced it was something new. Maybe respect. Maybe something else. But one thing was clear. This wasn't just a young man putting on a show. This was someone who had come prepared. Someone who had stepped into a courtroom where people expected him to fail, and instead, he had left them speechless. But the judge wasn't finished. Judge Prescott leaned back in his chair and tapped his pen on the desk. The room was still silent. No one dared to speak, waiting for what would happen next. Finally, he let out a slow breath and looked at Barron. Well, Mr. Trump, I have to say, I misjudged you. A few murmurs ran through the crowd, but the judge raised his hand and everyone went quiet again. His face was serious. The amused look he had before was gone. I have been a judge for a long time, he said. I've seen many people come into this courtroom thinking they can outsmart the law. Most of them fail. The room was still. People leaned in waiting. But you, the judge continued, tapping his desk, you didn't try to be flashy. You didn't waste time. You didn't throw around big words just to sound smart. You knew exactly what you were doing. Barron remained calm, but something in his posture shifted slightly. He hadn't expected the compliment. The judge tilted his head. Tell me, son, how long have you been studying law? Barron didn't hesitate. For years, Your Honor. The judge raised an eyebrow. And yet, you're not in law school. A beat of silence. Then Barron replied, his voice steady. Not yet. The judge let out a sharp breath through his nose. Then he shook his head. I'll tell you this, if half the lawyers in my courtroom were as prepared as you, my job would be a lot easier. The other lawyer sat stiffly, arms crossed. He had nothing to say. Judge Prescott straightened his glasses. The testimony remains in the case. That is final. Then he looked at Barron one last time. Mr. Trump, consider this your first test in law school. You passed. The gavel struck. Court was over. Barron gathered his notes, gave the judge a polite nod and walked out. The people in the room watched him go. No longer just the son of a former president, but something else. A force to be reckoned with. If you enjoy the story, drop a comment and let me know. Don't forget to subscribe for more adventures. Your support keeps the stories coming. See you in the next video.